I'm in shock that, there is this kind of federal framework basically saying that children should not be able to work in jobs deemed dangerous. And I'd imagine that covers meat processing and meat packing and things like that. But Iowa and their Republican governor signed a law basically completely flouting that. And if I'm getting the state right from the piece, saying no, children can work in meat processing plants. You're the expert. Is that true? And if so, like how is that not in violation of federal guidelines and federal law?
So that's such an interesting question. So the federal law, as we talked about at the outset, is a floor, not a ceiling. So every employer has to comply with the federal law, and then states are free to pass stronger laws. And many of them, most of them have. So in some of the cases when states are doing these rollbacks, in some cases they're rolling back their additional state protections and just to the federal level. But in Iowa, as you noted, I don't remember if it included meat packing, but it does allow teens as young as 14 to do formerly prohibited hazardous jobs in industrial laundries, or as young as 15 to do light assembly work, and also allows the state to waive certain restrictions on hazardous work for 16 and 17-year-olds in a list of hazardous occupations. And so this does raise the question, isn't the state, the way I understand this is that these employers still have to comply with state law. The state doesn't undo the federal law. So really the state, in my mind, the legislators think they're doing employers a favor by weakening the laws, but really what they're doing is putting them on a path toward endangering children, which is the most important thing, but also B, from a self-interest perspective for the employers, putting them on a path to violate federal law. These employers could be thinking that they're complying with state law, but in fact find themselves having penalties under federal law.
But do we have, and as I read this piece too, 16 states have one or more bills that could weaken their child labor laws. 13 are seeking to strengthen them. You cited the AGs in Massachusetts and a couple other states. I don't know if I would bet everything I own on it, but I would come close that those 16 states are dominated by Republican legislatures, and those 13 states are dominated by Democratic legislatures, which means, and I would imagine too, that the AGs out of those states are reflective of whatever the will is. So if you got a place like Iowa where the state law is actually subterranean to the basement of federal law, and like you said, that exposes the employers to certain liability. But is there a federal apparatus? I mean, because I would imagine we have been operating for decades, for the most part, where the feds don't have to worry about anything going below the basement because everything was in a state was either at that basement or higher in terms of standards. And the state AGs, they would have primary responsibility and the best, it seems to me, position to assess whether those laws are being broken. But is it OSHA? Or is it the Labor Department? Who is it that would police this? And do they even have the enforcement resources? Because it seems to me for decades, they haven't had to exert those resources to the extent that they would have to now in those 16 states that may have dropped their standards.
So there's a whole lot of different questions sort of embedded in that one question. As an initial matter, we have grossly insufficient resources to enforce our workplace laws, from child labor laws to minimum wage to workplace safety and health, to the laws that give workers the right to form and join unions. Really, this is just one more example of the public sector having been shrunken just totally inappropriately. So to give one example, the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, which enforces not only child labor laws, but also the minimum wage law, overtime, Family and Medical Leave Act, a whole bunch of laws. For the entire country at the end of 2023, they had 733 staffers for the whole country. That's 500 fewer than in the 1970s when the economy was significantly smaller. So that's just one example. OSHA is similarly grossly understaffed. At the state level, you're absolutely right. There are some states, the states that care about workers, that do have more robustly funded state labor departments or state AGs that take on workers' rights. But in some states, there's just like a couple of people who do wage and hour enforcement. In Florida, they don't even have a state Department of Labor, and the state AG does nothing in relation to enforcing workers' rights. So this is another one of those situations where it's kind of like a tale of two countries in terms of the resources, at the state level, the resources that are devoted to these issues. In terms of where the laws are being strengthened and weakened, generally, yes, it is in conservative states where there are conservative legislatures that the laws are being weakened. Although I would note that Virginia, for example, passed a bill this year increasing the penalties from $1,000 to $2,000, still grossly insufficient, but double what it was, right, for child labor violations, and that was signed by the governor. And then there are some conservative states that have not, haven't really had any rollbacks to date, like Oklahoma, for example, hasn't had any movement to roll back child labor laws. But overall, you're absolutely right that this is sort of playing out in somewhat of a partisan way, and also that the resources to enforce the law are grossly insufficient, both at the federal and state level.
How did child labor laws intersect with child abuse law? Or is it just strictly treated under kind of worker law or labor law?
That's a really interesting question. So generally, it's treated separately, although before my current position, I was the Labor Bureau Chief in the New York AG's office, and we did bring a couple of child labor criminal prosecutions, and one of them did involve some harming a minor, endangerment of a minor charges, which is different from child abuse, but still sort of along similar lines. I think it's an interesting question because in some places, conservatives have sought to pursue the parents for these violations, which, and in fact, I think one of the step parents or parents of a minor profiled in the New York Times story was arrested and later deported. And my own belief, based on the years that I spent many years enforcing workers' rights laws in New York State at the AG's office and the Labor Department. I believe that this is really, really dangerous policy and will drive child labor violations even more into the shadows because it will make people more fearful about reporting violations. A lot of times, all the years I was enforcing labor laws, employers often said, well, what we need is not enforcement. We need more education, right? And, that is, I'm that's not the approach that we took in the administrations that I worked. We were very focused on aggressive enforcement. But I think in relation to parents, with regard to child labor laws, the companies need enforcement, not education. The employers need enforcement. The parents need education and support. And, one serious problem is a lot of the minors in the unaccompanied minor situation or in immigrant minors, they don't have work permits, although they might be eligible for them. And so that means that it's harder for them to get employment with law-abiding employers. So even though they do need, in many cases to earn money to help support their families, there are employers and jobs that they can have if they're 14. It's just the difficulty in getting a work permit makes that harder.
And makes it harder for them to get somewhere safe, I guess, and not be exploited in that instance. Terri Gerstein, director of the Wagner Labor Institute at New York University. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.